Today, we're finally going to compare the Panzer M4 clone to the legit Benelli M4. But this isn't just any Benelli M4. This is the new Gen 2 model, and this has so much more going on with it than any of the Benelli M4s that have ever existed in the past. Now, the reason I wanted to make today's video is whenever I've made video comparisons in the past, there tends to be three types of people. There's the just as good guy who believes that anything you get that is very similar, that is a lot cheaper, is just as good as the original, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the elitist that believes that if you don't buy the OG, then nothing else can even remotely compare to it. And then you have everyone else in between who simply just don't want to waste their money. If the cheap version isn't any good, they don't want to waste their money on the cheap version. However, if the cheap version is pretty good and is quite reliable, they'd rather not waste their money on the expensive version. And in past videos over these years, we've had some cheaper guns that give you 90 to 95% of their more expensive counterpart for a fraction of the price. And then with other guns, sometimes it's better to just go with the real deal. And that's what I want to find out today. Now, you may have noticed recently in the past year or so that we've been seeing a huge influx of M4 clones coming out from various brands. They're all made in Turkey and then imported. And the reason we're seeing a huge influx in it is because Benelli's patent on the M4 expired in 2021. Similar to when Glock's patent expired on the Gen 3 Glocks. All of a sudden, we started getting this influx of all these new guns coming out that weren't Glocks, but looked like Glocks and functioned like Glocks. Some of them were awesome, some of them were crap. Also too, as we go through this video, we are going to be looking at a lot of cool stuff like this, and we're also going to be looking at some factory upgrades and stuff like that. So if you see anything in this video that you want to check out for yourself, I do create a parts list for everything that you're going to see in today's video. If you want to find that parts list, it's the very first link in the description, and I'll also pin that link in the comments section for you. Also, I was reading a lot of your guys' comments recently. It turns out that the amount of people that are watching these videos on their television is more than doubled over the past couple of years. And I bring that up because people that watch on televisions can't usually go to the description and click the link. So if that is you, I will throw a QR code up right here. Pause the video, scan that with your phone, and you'll see the parts list. By the way, if you could do me a huge favor, hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. The reason that I ask is whenever you do that, it trips the algorithm to show these videos who have never been exposed to 2A content before. And if that isn't a great way to shove it in the face of the anti-gunners, I don't know what is. Now, in all fairness, I do not expect the Panzer M4 to perform just as good as the Benelli M4. And the reason is Benelli M4s have a 26-year track record of being used and abused in militaries all around the world. The best way that I've found to think about Benelli M4s is they're kind of like the Glock of the shotgun world in regards to simplicity of their design, reliability and durability, as well as aftermarket support. And you might be wondering to yourself now, well, what the heck makes a Benelli M4 so reliable? Well, that's going to come down to the Argos system. The Argos system is the heartbeat of this rifle that makes it incredibly reliable. It's a dual piston gas system that's only comprised of 4 parts. It's self-cleaning and it's self-regulating, which means whenever you want to load up different types of loads of ammo into here, it will auto-adjust and you don't have to make any manual adjustments for it to cycle. In fact, during the military testing on the Benelli M4s, they put 25,000 rounds through one single rifle, and none of the parts failed and none of the parts needed to be replaced until after 25,000 rounds. So because of that, it's going to be very difficult to say that a cheap clone is going to perform the same way. But could it perform almost as good? Now, we're not going to go too deep into the Panzer M4 today because I have a dedicated video for that. If you want to watch that video, I will put a link right here so you can watch it later after this video. Now, the Panzer M4 isn't a perfect clone. And what I mean by that is, yes, you can kind of tell the difference between this and a standard Benelli, but it is a good clone in all the areas that seem to matter. The gas system on here looks almost identical to the Argos system on the legit Benelli M4. Both the Panzer as well as the Benelli M4 both have a chrome lined barrel. Not only that, but when I examined the bolts up close, they both appeared to be identical. Notice I said the word appear. That's because I don't know 100% if they're made of the same types of metals. There's not a whole lot of information about what types of materials are used for the bolt and stuff like that on the Panzer, whereas with the Benelli M4, you can find all that information very easily. I guarantee you that the Panzer doesn't go through this same amount of quality control as the Benelli. In the box, the Panzer comes already assembled. It had a lot of Cosmoline on it when I first unboxed it, just wiped it off. And then it also came with 2 extra chokes. There was 1 choke in the gun, and then you got a choke tool. So you got a total of 3 different chokes that you could choose from when you wanted to shoot it. Now they did cheap out in a couple of areas. Some people have said that the sights are very cheap on here. Honestly, they probably are, but I haven't had any problems with them yet. The biggest place where I've seen where they've cheaped out on here is with this top Picatinny rail. I talked about it in my previous video, but all of these screws along the Picatinny rail were way too loose. They were below factory specs. And so I had to take them out, add some Loctite, and torque them correctly. And this seems to be across the board with all Turkish M4s. So if you get one, you need to make sure that you test the torque on your Picatinny rail. Now the Panzer M4 comes in a ton of different colors, as well as a few different configurations.
Do you have any protection?
Oh, yes, ma'am. Assorted colors and textures.
For the configurations, there's mainly 2. You can get them with a fixed stock or a fixed skeletonized stock. Now, you'll notice that this one has an adjustable stock that I upgraded on it for dirt cheap. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the video. But aside from that, I've done 0 upgrades to this. I have been keeping this one stock on purpose so that we could get a good, reliable comparison between the 2. And these things can be had anywhere from 420 to 500 doll hairs. Now, when we look at the legit Benelli M4, you're gonna notice that this one doesn't look like most Benelli M4s. And that's because this is the new Generation 2. Prior to the Gen 2 version, if you were a civilian, you could not get a Benelli M4 that had a full 7-round tube. You had to get that aftermarket. Law enforcement and military, they could get the full tube. It also had a handguard on it that was very similar to this Panzer, which meant there was no way for you to mount a light on it without resorting to some aftermarket solutions. The OG Gen 1 had a very tiny bolt release similar to the one on the Panzer, and there was no sling swivel with a QD attachment up here on the front. So essentially the Gen 1 Benelli M4 looked exactly like this one. Now on the Gen 1s, they had a couple different stock options. They had the fixed synthetic stock, you had the fixed skeletonized stock. And then if you got the M1014, which is the military version of the gun, that one would come with a full tube, but if you weren't law enforcement or military, you still got the neutered tube. But it would come with an adjustable stock. And those were basically impossible to find. And if you got it with the fixed stock version, you were gonna be spending roughly 1,700 doll hairs. I'm saying doll hairs intentionally, I'm not trying to be cute, doing it because of algorithm stuff. And then if you wanted the military version, the M1014, you still got the neutered tube if you were a civilian, but then you get the adjustable stock. And that one cost 300 more for a total of 2,000 doll hairs. And you still didn't get a full tube, you still didn't get a good handguard, you had to do all that stuff separately. And the downside to upgrading a Benelli M4 after the fact, if you wanted to do factory upgrades, the parts were stupid expensive. And not only that, they were impossible to find, and when you did find them, it would take you months for you to receive them. The M4, although it's a great gun, it's always been a very price limiting gun. Now, in a previous video, we did a review on the Beretta 1301 Mod 2. I made a statement in that video, and I said one of the pros to the Beretta versus the Benelli, this one comes with a full 7-round tube, and the Benelli doesn't. Well, that was true on the Gen 1. That's no longer true on the Gen 2. In fact, this gun right here has over 1,187 doll hairs of factory upgrades on it, and it only cost 150 more than the military M1014. At the front here, we got a full 7-round tube. If you wanted that tube from the factory, they are about 125 doll hairs. Moving back, we now have this interesting handguard, which we're gonna dive up close and look at in a minute, because I got a couple of bones to pick about it. But it is a full factory upgrade. It does have ways to attach Picatinny to it, so you can attach lights like you see here, and it covers the top so that you can get a full grip around it and not burn your hand on the barrel. These things are almost 400 doll hairs if you were to pick them up separately. Now back here on the buttstock, this is an area that I think is really interesting. This is basically the Supernova stock. I love the way that the top comes up over the receiver. It makes it look like the curves of a sports car to me for some reason. But this one isn't like the old school stocks. Now, this isn't the Gen 1 stock for the Benelli, but it's very similar. On the Gen 1s, if you got an adjustable factory stock, you pressed a button, it turns, and then you could pull it out and twist it back. And it was only like 3 position available or something like that. Well, I like this new one better because 1, I like the cheek weld that's on the top. 2, it's just a simple button, you pull it straight back, and it's now 5 position adjustable. On this side, at least with this gun, not only does it have a QD point on the back, but it also comes with the QD connector so you can attach your sling to it. Now, if you have a Benelli M4 and you want to put this stock on it, it's going to cost you a whole lot of money because the stock is about $300 hairs, but then you got to get this proprietary tube, which is another $200 hairs. Crazy. Additionally, on the new one, we now have an enhanced bolt release. They've never had this in the past. You always had to go aftermarket if you wanted to do something like this, but it does come from the factory. If you were to do that yourself, that would cost between $125 and $175 hairs. We also have a QD sling swivel on the front. Those cost between $40 and $50 hairs. We no longer have the small factory charging handle. We now have a bigger charging handle. And if you wanted to do something like that yourself, I actually couldn't find a price on those. Without the cost of this charging handle, that's a total of $1,187 hairs in upgrades. Well, what's crazy about it is this only cost about $150 more than the military version M1014, and it has way more features. And to put that into perspective, if you were to pick up the basic M4, the one that was $1,700, and you did all of these upgrades that are on here to your basic one, it would total almost $3,000 hairs. If you were to do those same upgrades minus the stock that you would get on the M1014, it would still cost north of $2,700 hairs. So in a nutshell, this is essentially an M1014 on steroids. Pretty good considering everything that you get. Now, in regards to Benelli M4s, you can't get them in as many colors as you can, say, the Panzer. You can either get them in black or you can get them in the marine H2O coating. But there is a lot of different models that are available for them. So for example, this one has basic ghost ring sights on it. Then there's a model that's identical to this one that has night sights on it. Obviously, that one's like 100 or so more. Don't worry, I will have everything laid out at the parts list. That way you can find it easily. However, although this thing is pretty dang awesome and you get a lot for the money, it's not without its cons. Con number 1, it just kind of depends on how you look at it. I'm gonna say is with this handguard. Although this handguard is amazing, and although this handguard fits really well and is nice and snug, it is proprietary. There's no M-lock on here, and all these holes that are on here are just to make it lighter. There's no way to attach anything without Picatinny rail. But the downside is you have to use Benelli's Picatinny rail. Thankfully, in the box, it did include 2 or 3 different length Picatinny sections. I use one of those sections to attach a Streamlight. Now, I want to put some kind of hand stop on here, but the problem is when I use the Picatinny section and then put a hand stop, I start catching on the pick rail instead of the hand stop, and that really bothers me. So in the future, I'm going to be testing different types of handguards, not only with the legit Benelli, but also with the Panzer. And the reason I want to test different handguards is I know some aftermarket handguards have been known to fail. So I want to see which ones are good. At least with a factory upgraded handguard, you know it's not going to fail. Now, there is another downside to this. If you look at the top of this, and I have this light mounted on here, I had zip ties to keep this wire in place. There's only one zip tie left. I had one on both sides of the pressure switch, and I also had one back here on the wire. The downside is when you take this handguard off, the flange that's at the base of the barrel won't fit through the handguard if there's zip ties in there, and it essentially snapped all of those zip ties except for this one right over here. And that's kind of a bummer because if you're gonna put a light with a switch on here, you're definitely gonna wanna use zip ties to tidy everything up. But then if you use zip ties, it kind of messes with how easy it is to take apart and clean. Now this next one could be a pro or a con depending on how you look at it. So this barrel comes with a fixed modified choke, the same exact choke that is found on the military models. The downside with the fixed modified choke is you're not supposed to be shooting any types of slugs through here, especially steel slugs. Benelli has stated that the choke is just too tight and can cause a lot of problems. Some people have said that they can shoot rifled slugs through them. Some people have said that they can't. People argue about it all the time. But the downside is because you have a fixed choke, you don't get that option to switch up your ammo if you choose, if you wanted to do slugs. But if you're a Benelli M4 enthusiast and you know of some good slugged ammo ammo that works with these modified chokes, let me know down in the comments. I'll be sure to order some. Now, thankfully, you can get your barrel threaded for some chokes to make them removable. It only costs about 175 doll hairs to get that done. I'll have more info over at the parts list of reputable people that do that, and I might do that to this one, but I guess the pro of this is it's the same exact barrel that the military model has. But one of the biggest differences between the legit Benelli and the Panzer was, unlike the Panzer, this one did not come assembled in the box. When I unboxed this thing, it was in pieces. It wasn't that big of a deal. All I had to install was I had to install the bolt, I had to put the charging handle on, I had to put the barrel and the handguard on. But having never seen this type of handguard before, I didn't really know what I was doing. You would think when you're spending that much money on a gun, it would come already put together. Now, when it comes to the weight, the Panzer comes out to about 8.75 pounds. The legit Benelli came out to 9.4 pounds, and I'm assuming that has to do with the stock that's on it as well as the handguard. A little under a pound, but nonetheless, you can feel the difference. Now, all that stuff is fine and dandy, get a lot of features, that's cool, but how the heck do these things even shoot? With the Panzer M4, I tested this with a variety of different types of ammo. We have a little over 100 rounds through it right now, and we've tested it with birdshot, competition birdshot, we've shot slugs through it, as well as some double-aught buckshot. And throughout those first 100-ish rounds of testing, I only had one malfunction with this gun, and that was with a very cheap birdshot. All right, had a little malfunction there already. But after that one malfunction, I'd never had that same malfunction again, even when I used the same ammo. And I'm assuming that just has to do with breaking the gun in. With the Benelli M4, I had the exact same experience, a little over 100 rounds through it right now, same types of ammo that I ran through it, all the different types, and I had the same malfunction with the same type of ammo only one time. And then after that one malfunction, it didn't happen again. All right. So one failure to load on the super cheap ammo. Now, from what I've read, the Argo system and the M4s don't typically run well with light ammo. I knew that going into it. But the fact that both of these had the exact same number of rounds and had the exact same number of malfunctions, that just kind of surprised me. Now let's talk about the recoil impulse. Between both guns, the hardest hitting ammo that I had was double-aught buck. I will say this, between the Panzer and the legit Benelli, I felt like the Benelli was shot a little bit softer, but that might be due to the increase in weight on here. And I'm pretty much convinced that that's the only reason that the recoil is softer, because when I did the review on the Beretta 1301 Mod 2, this thing comes out to under 7 pounds. And when I was shooting double-aught buck through this one, it was not a pleasant experience. This thing kicked the hardest out of all the shotguns I've tested so far, but it's also the lightest weight one. Now, there was one big difference in the shooting experience between the Panzer and the Benelli. For whatever reason, when I try to ghost load my Panzer, if you don't know what ghost loading is, I'll tell you real quick. You fill up your mag tube, you put one in the chamber, and then you put one on top of this carrier right here. It's like a +1 on top of your +1 in the chamber. For whatever reason on this one, whenever I ghost load it, it would never cycle that next round. I don't know why, but this one doesn't like to be ghost loaded. Now, I've done a lot of research, watched a lot of other people's videos, as well as texted people that I know that have these. Nobody I know has had that same issue. I have a sample size of 1, and I think the issue is only on mine. And I'm gonna look into some ways on fixing that, but it is something to be noted. The Benelli, when I ghost load it, it works perfect. Another thing to keep in mind is, although one of these guns tends to be a little bit softer shooting with double-aught buck, they seem to cycle at the same rate. I'll show you some slow motion footage here of the cycle rate. I'm gonna have to edit this footage so that I can align when I pull the trigger, and that way you'll see the cycling of the bolt, and you be the judge if it's the same or not. So let's talk about upgrades real quick, because in the future, I am gonna make some videos on some upgrades. Now, when we look at the legit Benelli, this thing is upgraded to the hilt from the factory already. Not too shabby. The only thing that I would probably upgrade on here that is kind of bothering me is the handguard. Although I love the fact that it came with this handguard, I think it's awesome. But I want to try something that has M-lock on it, because I'm not a fan of having to use Picatinny rail to put a hand stop on here, nor am I a fan of using proprietary pick rail. That, and then also the whole thing with the zip ties, That's just kind of my biggest problem with this. Another thing that I'm gonna change on here is I don't know if I'm gonna leave this light on here or not. I was originally running these HRT tactical lights. I love these things to death. They have like a battle nipple right here. I talked about it in a previous video, and I'll have some info about these over at the parts list. But I like these because you don't need a pressure pad to use them, and you can use them like a standard light with a push button if you want. This will work phenomenally well. Unfortunately, it's not gonna work on this rail. So the only other upgrade I could think of that you might wanna get for this, and this all is gonna depend on you and what your purposes are for this, is if you want to shoot slugs, you're probably going to have to send this off and get this threaded so you can change out the chokes, but to each their own. Now, when it comes to the Panzer, I've already done this one upgrade on the stock. This stock is made by Panzer, and I had to get the stock and the tube, and I believe it was like 70 doll hairs for everything. And the other thing that I'm going to upgrade on here is obviously the handguard, because I do want to put a light on here, but I can't right now. One of the previous downsides to the Panzer or any other Turkish clone is that none of the extension tubes that worked for Benelli M4s would work on these. But thankfully now Panzer has actually just released 2 different tubes for this in different colors. They got a full length as well as an extension that goes on the end here. I've actually ordered both of them so we can test them, and I'll have more information about those over at the parts list if you want to check them out. But aside from that, because this thing hasn't had any problems yet, there's nothing else for me to upgrade yet. So knowing what we know now, let's go over the pros and cons real quick. Benelli pros. Obviously, it's reliable, it's freaking durable. So when you get these, you get that peace of mind of the 26 years and it's being in service with militaries around the world, and it comes with a 10-year warranty. It worked with every single type of ammo that I put through it, aside from the one malfunction during break-in. And this one, like I said earlier, includes a ton of upgrades for the price. The cons about this is also the price. This is a buy once, cry once type gun, but the downside is that eliminates a lot of people from being able to afford it. The other downside, all the factory parts are almost unobtainium to get separately, and when you do find them in stock, they're stupid expensive and they take a long time to arrive. The con on this one too, like I said earlier, I'm not a big fan of the handguard, and I don't know how I feel about having non-removable chokes, but I'm gonna consider that a con. Now let's talk about the Panzer M4. Pros. It's cheap. And these things can be had anywhere from 420 to 500 doll hairs. For example, if you got one of these and maybe you started having some reliability issues, you can go get factory Benelli M4 parts, put it on there, upgrade it to make it reliable, and you're still gonna be a heck of a lot cheaper than with legit Benelli. Pro number 2, as of right now with our testing, as I said, I've only had one malfunction with the same amount of rounds as the Benelli M4, so as of right now, it's just as reliable. That may change in the future, I don't know. This one does come with a warranty. It's only 1 year, but hey, it's only 420 doll hairs, so who cares? Not only does this have large aftermarket support, because it'll work with most Benelli M4 parts, but now Panzer is coming out with some of their factory upgrades, as I mentioned, with the new tubes, as well as with the stock, and they're way cheaper than Benelli parts ever thought about being. Cons. The biggest con is it has no history of being reliable or durable. We simply don't know yet, and there's no way for any gun tuber to replicate 26 years of something being in service in the military. All we can do is put rounds through it and see what we think about it moving forward. Downside 2, the lack of QC on these screws on the top. Aside from that, it's kind of hard to be harsh on this gun because of the affordable price of it. Now, I will say this, between both of these guns, this is not the most fair comparison ever. Not because this one's a Benelli and because this one is a Panzer. It's not the most fair comparison because the Gen 2 exist. Because the original Gen 1 Benelli M4s didn't have all those cool upgrades on it. And I think that this one, if I was gonna compare features of the gun, is more comparable to the Gen 1. I mean, the Gen 1s are still 1,700 doll hairs. When you compare the Gen 2 to the Panzer, I feel like the gap between the value for what you get is a lot better on the new Gen 2s than they were on the Gen 1s, and so it's not as fair of a comparison. And that's the reason I think that Benelli has taken so long to come out with a Gen 2 is because they simply had no competition before their patent expired. They had zero. Their only competition was the Beretta 1301, and Beretta owns Benelli, so it wasn't even competition. If people bought that, Beretta still made money. But now that the patent has expired, I have a feeling we're gonna see the same type of thing we saw with the Glocks when the Gen 3 patent expired. You know, the first ones that came out were kind of crappy. You know, they weren't that great and weren't that reliable. But then as more and more companies started creating Glock clones for Gen 3, they started getting better. And in fact, they've gotten so good that I now personally carry a Glock clone. hence the shadow system. Now that doesn't mean that all of the clones for the Benelli M4 that'll be coming out are gonna be great, but the good news is that creates competition, and that's gonna mean that companies are gonna do more and more R&D on their clones to make them better. And I think that Benelli knew that was gonna happen, and they knew if they didn't start adding more value for what you get for the money, then people were simply just gonna start buying the clones once the clones got to be pretty good. Now, if I were in the market and I was looking for either one of these, I think that the Panzer M4 is perfect for going to the range and having fun. I think that the Panzer M4 is a good way to test the waters to see if you'll even like a Benelli M4, because when you're shooting these, they don't feel much different. They feel almost identical. If this one had the same weight as this one, I wouldn't hardly be able to tell the difference if I was shooting these with my eyes closed. That's how close they feel. Whether or not I would trust my life with this, I can't say yet. I need to get more rounds through this. I know that James over at TFB TV has done a lot of videos with M4 clones, and they have claimed that they've never had one surpass 500 rounds without any problems. So we got 400 rounds to go on this one until we can make that decision. But if that is the case, then over time, as we keep putting rounds through both of these, this one should start showing problems and showing that it's more inferior than the legit Benelli. So I would say this: if we were gonna compare the Panzer to the Gen 1, I would say you get about 90% of the features of the gun for about 20% of the price. But because we're comparing it to this, which gives you a ton for your money, I would say that number drops to 70 to 75%. So I'd say with this one, you get about 70 to 75% of this for about 20% of the price. But I'm just one person. My opinion doesn't really matter. I'm just telling you what my experience is. But let me know your thoughts down below, guys. And then if you wanna know more about this fella right here, this is probably the fastest, flattest shooting shotgun I've ever tested, then go check out this video right here, because this thing will blow your mind. But until next time, guys, I love you, and you guys stay sexy.